Good afternoon. I'm Geoff Stone, and it's my privilege to serve as moderator of this afternoon's event. I believe the role of a moderator is to be invisible, so I will be brief and moderate. The first thing I want to note is the 5 people up here before you have an accumulated 200 years of experience in higher education, 158 of which are at the University of Chicago. It's Jonathan Cole who wrecks that statistic, the difference between Chicago and the others. I'll briefly introduce each of our speakers in reverse order in which they will speak. And the reverse order is really just to keep you on your toes. It's sort of a test. Rick Schwader is the William Claude Rivas Distinguished Service Professor of Human Development at the University of Chicago. Rick is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and twice has been a Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. John Boyer is the Martin A. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor of History and Dean of the College. John has served as Dean of the College since 1992, the longest tenure in the history of the university, and he has been a truly great Dean. And he's also received numerous awards for his research on the history of the Habsburg Empire, including, among many others, the Austrian State Prize for Modern History. Steve Berry is the James Franck Distinguished Service Professor of Chemistry Emeritus at the University of Chicago. He, by the way, has the longest tenure of any of us. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and recipient of numerous national and international medals, awards, and prizes for his research. Jonathan Cole, our main speaker, is the John Mitchell Mason University Professor at Columbia University, where he served as provost from 1989 to 2002. Jonathan and I got to know each other when I was provost here and he was provost there, and he both began before me and outlasted me, as he did every other provost in the United States at that time. A distinguished scholar of the sociology of science, John is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Philosophical Society, and a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In his new book, The Great American University, John makes a spectacular contribution to our understanding of American culture, particularly the culture of higher education. And it is that book that brings us here this afternoon. In this work, Jonathan explores, as the subtitle suggests, the rise of the American university to preeminence, its indispensable national role and its contributions, and why it must be protected, and why indeed it is in a fragile position. Perhaps not surprisingly, we here at the University of Chicago were especially intrigued about how Jonathan sees the University of Chicago in his story. And that indeed will be the focus of our program today. Jonathan, we're delighted and honored to have you here at the University of Chicago, where you truly belong. Despite the Columbia blue. We will proceed as follows. Jonathan Cole will speak for roughly 20 minutes. Then Steve Berry, John Boyer, and Rick Schwader will each speak for 10. Then Jonathan will have an opportunity to respond, and then we will open the floor for discussion and questions. Thank you. Jonathan?
Thank you very, very much, Jeff. It's really good to be with you here at my second favorite research university in the world. And I'm very pleased to be able to be here to talk about this book that I've recently published. However, briefly, I think Jeff has assigned me 20 minutes, and we're going to go through those 600 pages and tell you what's in them in that amount of time. So let me get right to the point. When most educated Americans think about our great universities, they simply don't really think about that lasers, the FM radio, magnetic resonance imaging, global positioning systems, barcodes, transistors, improved weather forecasting, cures for childhood leukemia, pap smear, methods of surveying public opinion, all had their origins at research universities. One can go on and on. The algorithm for Google, the fetal monitor, the nicotine patch, antibiotics, the Richter scale, buckyballs, the discovery of the insulin gene, the origin of computers, bioengineering as a result of the discovery of recombinant DNA, the electric toothbrush, Gatorade, the Heimlich maneuver at Cornell, and even Viagra had its origins at American universities. Now, most members of the educated public think of these universities in terms of undergraduate education and to some extent professional school education, in terms of teaching and really transmission of knowledge, more than they do about the creation of knowledge. And one of the things that got me to write this book was the number of conversations that I had with alums of Columbia and other universities in which we would answer questions about the university, and almost invariably this led to questions about whether the core curriculum at Columbia was intact, whether we were still reading the same exact passages as we were in 1919, whether or not the integrity of the curriculum was there. But rarely, very, very rarely, did anyone raise the question, you know, in the last 5 years, what are the 3 most important or most interesting discoveries that have been made at Columbia University? In fact, this is not the way they thought about the university. And yet, what makes, I believe, and what I argue in this book, these universities as the most distinguished set of universities in the world, that is the great research universities, is not the quality of their undergraduate education, which after all can be equaled in many cases at the great liberal arts colleges and other places around the world, or in our ability to transmit knowledge in general, but it's really the fact that these universities have produced extraordinary knowledge that have changed our lives in ways that most educated Americans are simply unaware of. I wanted to tell the story in this book of how great universities came to be the great engines of innovation in the nation, and how they achieved this in a relatively short period of time, and why today I believe that they are under some severe threats. Now, first we have to begin by what is the evidence that these are really the greatest universities in the world, and I take as several pieces of evidence the fact that there have been studies which would show that of the top 50 universities in the world, based upon research performance and various other indicators, it's about 80% of the top 20 are American, 75% of the top 50, and about 60 to 65% of the top 100. Today. Other indicators of the greatness is the dominance, for example, in the receipt of Nobel Prizes. About 60 to 65% of all Nobel Prizes since the Second World War have gone to American scientists. Before January 1933, probably the same proportion went to German scientists. If you look comparatively, you will not find one Russian university in the top 50. And top 75, actually. Not one German university today in the top 50. Not one Chinese university in the top 200. Another indicator would be the production of literature in the scholarly archives that are of a kind and quality that have an enormous impact. And we continue to dominate the production of that high-impact literature. In fact, the American research universities have become the envy of the world, because many of the brightest and most able young people want to attend it and work there. They represent collectively perhaps the only American industry, higher education that is, with a favorable balance of trade today. Now, this is a long book, and it's not easy to summarize it, I would say, in a very short period of time. So let me try to do it with some of the central themes that I address in greater depth and more extensively in the book, and try to summarize some of the major points very, very briefly. First of all, I think many of us don't realize how young this system is. It's really highly embedded in the dynamics of the larger American society. And if you look at the history of the research university as such in the United States, it really begins in 1876, 100 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, with the opening of Johns Hopkins University and Daniel Coit Gilman as the first president. And it really doesn't begin to take off in any sense as a significant force until the turn of the 20th century. By 1930s, the set of values which are at the very core of the universities come into place, and they crystallize. And the structures on which those universities were built were fairly well established by the 1930s and 40s. But the takeoff begins, at least I located, and it's of course arguable, in January 1933, and it doesn't reach full speed until after the Second World War. So when you think about the dominance of this set of institutions and how relatively recent that dominance is, how quickly we were able to move to the very apex of universities around the world, it didn't take very long. Now, one of the elements which was extremely important beyond the values and the structures that were put in place was the extraordinary post-war science policy that came out of the war, that was derived in many ways from the effort during the war, and that was represented in this sort of great treatise that Vannevar Bush created, called Science, the Endless Frontier, created with the help of 4 committees, but nonetheless, basically it was his policy instruments. It's an extraordinary document. If you haven't read it, you can just read the preface, and you'll see one of the great science policy documents that's ever been produced. And it had a lot to do, I argue, with the ability of the American Research University to really take off after the war, and part of that, as I will come back to, is a result of the infusion of enormous resources by the federal government into these universities, which heretofore they had not had. So it is really these discoveries that come out of these institutions. It is the fragility of them that I'm concerned with. And I want to talk about some of the aspects of each of these themes. Let me talk about the values of these universities. And many of them that the American universities have embraced are derived from values that grew up with science in the West, from 17th century science in England and onward. But some of them are extraordinarily important and I think essential for greatness. One is the value or norm of universalism, or often referred to as meritocracy. That is to say, individuals should be judged in the system by the quality of their work and not by any ascribed characteristic such as gender, nationality, social origin, or race. Now, let me say right off the bat that we still haven't totally realized that value. That is to say, we haven't optimized it entirely by any stretch of the imagination, but we have come closer than many others to realizing it. A second value is one of organized skepticism, and that is that there was an incessant questioning, or there should be an incessant questioning, of claims to fact and truth by those who are putting up propositions as truth or fact. That is to say, universities should entertain radical ideas, but they should do it within the framework of a very conservative methodology of proof and high levels and standards of proof for claims to fact and to truth. Other values that were part of the university that were critical are, of course, free inquiry and academic freedom. Disinterestedness was a core value, which said, interestingly enough, that knowledge should be a public good and that individual faculty members shouldn't profit from those the discoveries that they make. This probably is the value and norm which has undergone the greatest transformation in the last 25 years in the major universities in the nation, and that's partly a result of the interest in finding new revenue streams, the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980-1982, and the ability of universities to own the patents and the intellectual property rights for discoveries which take place within their walls. Now, other values that are critical is the existence of a peer review system, working for the common good, the notion that scholarship in science should not have borders or boundaries, that it's a truly international matter, that governance should be done by authority rather than by power, that we should be concerned about the turnover and vitality in the community, and a host of values that are associated with creating a new intellectual progeny. Now, one of the things which I want to try to pick up here as a theme to this particular session is why I think the University of Chicago is an ideal type. I think that Chicago, for me, represents a closer approximation over time of the realization of two of these very important core values. One, of course, is academic freedom and free inquiry. And you find it, you can go back historically and you can begin to find the origins of this, as John Boyer has suggested in some work that he's done, even in Harper's work in the early days. But it obviously comes to its peak and its height with Hutchins' defense of academic freedom and free inquiry against the Broyles Commissions, and throughout much of his presidency. And the interesting part of it is that it becomes deeply embedded in the culture of the University of Chicago, it seems to me, as an outsider, and that it is carried on by all of the extraordinary leaders that Chicago has had since, so that you have obviously, you have Edwin Levy, you have Hannah Gray, you have, right up to the current point in time, you have this deep commitment, greater than at any other institution that I know of the belief in individuals operating as critics, as proposers of ideas, where there is, in fact, more of at the University of Chicago than elsewhere, a sense of a meritocracy of ideas. And that nobody speaks for the university. The president, the provost, whoever it might be in positions of authority, do not, in fact, speak for the university. This comes out of the Calvin Committee report of 1967, and is very, very much part of this culture. And to me, it's the greatest. It's the greatest approximation of that value in the American system of research universities. And then I think, actually, the University of Chicago doesn't really get as much credit in the sort of history of the research university for the approximation of meritocracy. In fact, Cornell began early on, and there were efforts at Harvard later by Conan to open up Harvard to people of ability rather than necessarily the right pedigree. But when people were changing the composition of their undergraduate student bodies and excluding religious minorities, for example, in the 1920s at Harvard and Columbia and places like that, this university was really much more open than others, it seems to me, to people coming in on the basis of their talent, not necessarily what their social origins might be. Now, let me say a few things about what led to the rise of preeminence of these universities. One is that they recruited exceptionally talented people from wherever they might be found, anywhere on the globe. There was enlightened and bold leadership from the outset. There was a commitment to a very, very high level of autonomy from the state. The state was not going to control higher education, what went on in these research universities. And there was an extremely strong belief in competition among the universities for talent. And I think that element of competition plays a very important role in the growth of these universities. Chicago, of course, was at the center of it from its very beginning. Harper was extraordinary at trying to recruit members of the faculty from either budding universities on the East Coast to the great, more older universities, and he did an extraordinary job at recruiting them. And even if we're in an era of academic free agency today, we are still in a situation where the competition which exists for talent pushes the system and its boundaries further to open up not only new facilities and new resources that lead to new discoveries, but it even leads to the extension of the boundaries of fields into new fields, and indeed opening up jobs and opportunities for scholars and scientists. So you can get too much of a good thing, and perhaps we have reached the point where one can say there's too much competition in the system. But compared to, for example, the European nations and their research universities today, the total absence of competition has hurt them remarkably in terms of their efforts to reestablish their greatness. It's been, I think, a very positive force in American research universities. Of course, the American system was built out of an amalgam of the German system, and the envy that we had for the German system early in the 20th century. That was a system which was built and focused around research and the relationship between masters as it were and apprentices, or leaders, professors, and their students, with the object of producing new knowledge. And that was joined with the more traditional Oxford-Cambridge model of undergraduate education. What we extended was certainly a democratic sensibility and a democratic value system that replaced in many ways the hierarchy which existed in Europe. And I think that it turned out to be a very good thing, but nonetheless it was a hybrid model that we had produced. Because I'm very much conscious of time and Jeff being very good at cutting people off, let me try to focus on just a few kinds of things related to the path that these universities followed to their greatness, and then shift over very quickly to what I think some of the threats are and spend just a few minutes on that. Until 1933, and I would say January 1933, when Hitler came to power, the greatest research universities in the world were the German universities. And if you wanted to see the extreme form of the violation of meritocracy and universalism, it comes in Germany, of course. It's the limiting case. And by April of 1933, many of the great universities of Germany, certainly Berlin and Göttingen, had been stripped of many of their very, very top professors on the basis of extraneous factors such as religion and their political positions. And this led to an enormous exodus from these European universities. And fortunately, many of them found their homes in the United States, where they were given safe haven, and they were actually allocated strategically to places where they could offer leadership to a growing community of younger scholars who were very, very good, but who lacked the kind of leadership that had existed at these German universities. So in some sense, we have the beginning point for the takeoff being the ironic twist that the horrors that we see in Europe lead to outcomes in the United States that are actually positive for our universities. Let me hold off to the question period the details of the science policy that made a huge difference, and only say that the key elements in it were the decision by the United States to use taxpayer dollars to invest them in the production of new knowledge after the war, and to do that by essentially outsourcing these resources to universities as the site where the research would actually take place. The coupling of that research with students and the education of graduate students, doctoral students, postdoctoral students was critically important for the development of these universities. And the capital that they received, which was far greater than what could be obtained from foundations or from private sources, had an enormous positive effect on catapulting the system forward. But let me wait and talk about other elements in that remarkable policy following the war to the question period, if you have some of it. And let me move then to the question of, well, you know, what is it that is challenging us as we look forward, and what are some of the threats? And I should add that, you know, the economic impact of these research universities are enormous. And as a footnote almost, if you look, for example, at Stanford as of 2008, the companies that were founded just by the graduates of Stanford or their professors, the 2004 companies that they look at, produced and generated $255 billion of total revenue in 2008. MIT similarly had companies that were related to MIT in one way or another that generated $232 billion of revenue, which is a little less than the gross domestic product of South Africa and Thailand, just to give you a sense of the size of this, which would make MIT companies among the 40 largest economies, for example, in the world. So we've done all these remarkable things. Why is this system, I think, under threat? Well, part of it is, I think, that the academic freedom and free inquiry value is under attack. And to the extent that we falter in maintaining that and defending it, I believe that we will have very severe problems at the university. Let me talk about some of the specifics of that, or at least allude to some of the specifics of that. But to do it by saying that I don't believe, in general, that the greatest source of threat to the preeminence of American research universities come from abroad. I don't believe that it's the Chinese universities at the moment, or the European universities, which are in a state of disarray, quite frankly, that are going to be challenging us in the immediate future. In fact, while they have enormous human capital and human capital potential, they have such structural limits and problems that they are not immediately going to threaten us. And besides that, more importantly perhaps, is that the competition from abroad should not be viewed as a negative thing. Competition from those university systems would actually probably be good for the overall production of knowledge, the solution of many important problems, including cures of diseases and things like that. And we will probably get better if we actually have strong competition from abroad. And on an individual level, we know at the moment that there is enormous international globalization of collaborations already. Institutionally, we may not have that much, and we may be separate in many ways. But we know that collaborations are taking place on the individual level that is highly international already. So if there is a problem, if there is an enemy, just to paraphrase the wonderful cartoon character of Walt Kelly, I think the enemy is us. We are capable of destroying ourselves or harming ourselves. The things that I discuss at some length in this book are the effects and the consequences, perhaps even unintended consequences, of anti-terrorist legislation, and the effects it has had on research at American universities, which most people really don't know very much about. Restrictive visa policies are another one. We have a pipeline to the best students in the world, and if we close off that pipeline, and we don't have the wherewithal within our own society to produce the scientists and engineers through our own educational system, we are going to be cutting off a talent base that is extraordinarily important for us. And we should know, if we don't already, that if you look at nations like the People's Republic of China, they're sending over graduate students, PhD students. About 90% of those students, after they get their PhDs, remain in the United States, have jobs here in industry or in academics and various other places. They don't, in large proportions, return home. There are efforts in the last 10 years to essentially censor scientific publications, or to put prior restraint on the publication of certain kinds of works, for example, in biology and the biological sciences. There is increased surveillance of activities on universities by law enforcement agencies like the FBI. And there are, under the Patriot Act, there are sections of the Patriot Act which allow the FBI, for example, to go into a library and to ask for the habits of individual students or faculty members, and the librarian or whoever is asked for that cannot tell the people who are under surveillance or the objects of the investigation that they are in fact being investigated. There are a whole host of ways in which research has been under attack, and let me try to suggest a number of them, just count them off, because I know I'm running out of my time, Jeff. Ideological positions are being imposed on the conduct of research, or have been, certainly over the last 10 years. And examples can be found in things like embryonic stem cells research, and the effects that that has had on the American initiatives to grow that field. Global climate change. There have been efforts to censor scientists like Jim Hansen, whose work on climate change did not meet the approval of his bosses at NASA, although it was fine with the people at Columbia. And they tried to actually examine his speeches and examine his papers and edit those papers and speeches in advance of their publication. He didn't allow them to do it, but they were doing it with others as well. There were efforts to intrude upon the peer review system and make political appointees to the peer review system, where non-experts were being used to make judgments about quality and program quality. So in short, there have been efforts by the government to intrude into the domain that has been rather sacred for universities. It's not that the government hasn't in the past tried to do this, but it continues to do it now, and in a way that attacks the research base more than simply matters of, I won't say simply, but as well as matters of speech. Let me also tick off a number of others that I will be happy to explore with you and are explored in much greater depth in the book. First of all, there's the dismantling of the great public university system that's going on by the disinvestments in some of the greatest systems of higher learning in the world. The University of California system is under threat today by the lack of willingness of the state to invest in it. They have great fiscal constraints, but they are spending more on prisons than they are spending on higher education. There are choices to be made there, and the question of whether they're making good choices or proper choices, and what the consequences of their choices are going to be, is another matter. At the moment, it looks like they're damaging significantly great institutions like Berkeley, UCLA, University of California, San Francisco, and University of California, San Diego, among the others. I would also just like to mention, because I know Jeff thinks of this as a major problem. I think of it as a very clear problem. I perhaps don't think of it as dangerous as some others, but it is nonetheless something we really have to worry about, and that is the commercialization of intellectual property. You know, are universities selling their souls to the devil in order to generate revenues from a variety of different sources? And there has unquestionably been an erosion of the norm of disinterestedness. The question is, have we gone too far? And are we corrupting this core value in the university? And then another, and finally, there are a number of others, but let me just mention one other, and that is that there is aspects of a kind of intellectual conformity that has crept into universities that I think is very disquieting. I call it the herd of independent minds, and the tendency towards intellectual orthodoxy. I think you find it less at Chicago. I mean, one of the things I admire greatly about this university is the willingness of people with very, very different views, extraordinarily different views, not only on all sides of the political spectrum, but also different views, whether they be different scientific views, to engage in free and open discourse where they are judged on the quality of their arguments and the quality of their evidence, rather than whether or not it conforms to some set of prior beliefs, ideological beliefs of what is true, what is fact. I don't think Chicago is perfect in this by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they do it better than virtually anyone else. Now, you might ask, well, isn't this, if I've been talking about the last 10 years, isn't the Obama administration different? And my sense is this, that when President Obama came into office, there was a sense of relief at most research universities that the world was going to change for them in important ways. Aspects of the Patriot Act would be gotten rid of. They were harmful to libraries and others. And I believe personally the president does get it. I mean, he's a product of the University of Chicago in some sense. He was, he's here, so he's got to get it, right? He was part of this university culture. He wasn't not an undergraduate here. He was an undergraduate at Columbia, so he got it partly from them as well. But it's one thing to have the president get it in the Oval Office, and as we have seen with abundant and great clarity, it's one thing for the president to see it, another thing to change policy. And I haven't seen any changes in the anti-terrorism laws that would benefit the universities and cut off some of the restrictive policies which existed under the prior administration. Okay, let me close, and then hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about some other things later on in the fuller discussion. I personally don't believe that there's any reason why the United States can't maintain its position of preeminence among the great research universities in the world. And I actually think that there's just enormous unrealized potential here to get much greater and to do still greater things. And I wouldn't fear foreign competition, which I don't believe is not only imminent, but I don't think once it emerges, which it probably will 25 years from now or whatever, will actually be bad for the system. I actually think it will be good for the system of higher learning and good for the growth of knowledge. But there really are a set of choices that I think have to be made, and I think that the United States is capable of blowing it. I mean, choices about investments and where we're going to invest and various kinds of policies that might intrude on that core value system. And if we follow the path being taken by many states today in dealing with their great universities, we may lose some of the luster, maybe a good deal of the luster that we have. And that's the great test that we face. And it remains, for me at least, an open question whether or not we'll pass it. Thank you very much.
I think I'll just sit here. First, I would like to thank Jonathan for the very kind and I hope accurate things that he says in his book about the University of Chicago. The most impressive come very late in the book, so you have to read the whole book to get to it. Let me talk a little bit about this university and how in some ways I think we minimize some of the problems here and optimize some of the things you like. But let me begin by saying when I was in high school, I knew I should not come to the University of Chicago. I was not mature enough. I went to Harvard. That was okay. But only the most intellectually mature person in my high school class came to Chicago, and I wasn't ready for it. On the other hand, I have found this is the right place for me. Of all the universities I know well, this is the one where I feel most natural, most comfortable, for a variety of reasons, and I'll go into those reasons, because I think they characterize not only Chicago, but they characterize what I think we would like universities to be. Let me begin with the point that Jonathan made about challenging ideas. A little experience I had not very long after I'd come to the University of Chicago. We had a public debate about air pollution, which was a very, very serious problem at that time in the late 60s. And I was for controls, and the opponents were a team of Harold Demsetz and Ron Coase and Milton Friedman. Harold was first, and the very first thing he said was, "We do not yet have enough air pollution." Harold was in many ways epitomizing the way the University of Chicago challenges accepted, unexamined ideas. And of course, he had rational basis for that, and we were able to counter it. But the important thing was the way he challenged. I think that in that sense, I think of this as a university that is wonderful for some people, but not for everybody. Because the essence of this university is it's a place where criticism is considered the way you make things better. If you're not comfortable with criticism, this is not a good place for you. On the other hand, if you love to live with it, if you love to discuss and examine challenges, this is the most exciting place I know. And in that sense, the kinds of students we get, the kinds of students who apply here, by and large understand that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have a lower ratio of applicants to acceptances than Ivy League schools, because the students who apply here know what the University of Chicago is. And they don't want to come here unless they already have this kind of life in mind. Another thing that I think is very important here that Jonathan did not mention, but I think that it's very, very characteristic of this university. Of all the institutions I know, we have the softest boundaries between disciplines. It's the easiest place in the world to collaborate with people in other fields. Illustration. In about 1970, David Curry from the law school, Dan Jansen, an ecologist, and I decided we wanted to start giving a course in environmental management. Where in this curriculum, this whole college structure, should we put it? Well, I called the chairman of urban studies because we thought maybe that would be a possibility. And I asked him or I mentioned to him that we would like the three of us to give this course, and I expected him to say, "Oh, okay, I'll bring it up with my department." The reply I got was, "Oh, great, I'll give you a number." And that was the course. And it started, and it went on for years. And right now, George Tolley and I, the economists, are giving a course together on energy and energy policy. And it was the easiest thing in the world. We did it under Bill Wibsat's Big Problems program. The biologists and physical scientists collaborate informally, constantly. And you know people in other departments, in other parts of the university, in ways that people don't at most other universities that I know. Now, there are some things that need fixing, and there are departments that are not so harmonious as my own, for example. There are some departments that have lots of people that really aren't interested in other areas, but I think math has a number of people who really do collaborate with others, but it has a tradition that math is for mathematicians, and it's sort of amusing to many of us to watch that. But I think, and there are some departments that are very democratic and some that are not so democratic, and I think that's partly because of traditions in some subjects. But these are not really problems that keep this university from being the kind of place that Jonathan is describing. Now, I think he's right that there are threats, and I think that some of the threats that are associated with a kind of national pattern of overreacting in terms of threatening personal freedoms, academic freedoms, not only now after 9/11, but I think historically this has happened. It happened in the McCarthy period, and it's happened in other earlier times too. But I think we'll come through. I'm optimistic about these things. And I'd like to take the last couple of minutes to raise something that you didn't discuss in your book or here, about the evaluation of universities. We are very good at evaluating universities based on things like the number of applicants, based on their endowment, based on the number of Nobel Prizes. One thing we have to keep in mind is that one of the major products of universities is supposed to be educated people, creative people. I have never seen an evaluation of universities that is measured on the basis of the creativity of the alumni. The people that have come through our system and have learned to think and examine new ideas. Have we ever tried to examine how well we and other universities do in producing creative people? I don't think we have, and I would love to see this introduced as a means of evaluating universities.
For those of you who haven't had the chance to read Jonathan's book yet, it's really quite a remarkable it's a remarkable set of stories and a product of great erudition and wise judgment. I thought I might just talk about, and it's filled with a lot of things that are, I think, quite important he didn't have a chance to mention today. I just want to just amplify three things that he did raise, or at least touched upon a little bit today. One is the question of the German model, then the question of teaching, and then finally I feel I have to say something about Hutchins. So. There's been a lot of research on the history of the German universities in the last 15 to 20 years, and some of it hasn't been very complimentary, some of it has been quite fascinating, and there are lots of kind of demythification, attacking the whole notion of the Humboldtian university as a model that actually informed 19th century practice, and in fact, much of the work that Humboldt, that was used to define the Humboldtian moment as war was really not discovered until 1895 or 1896, after most of the century had transpired. But I do want to say two things about the German universities. First, the Americans who went there, many of them didn't really understand very much what they were seeing, and some did. Breschted, for example, here was a guy who went over for many years and it really became very much acculturated to the German university. But there were others, people like James Tufts, who was a very distinguished psychologist, went over for 6 months. You could actually get a German PhD in 6 months if you were very careful about it and economical. And Tufts lived in an American community, went to an American expatriate church. His wife was there. His diaries, which are in the archives, are, he had a wonderful time, ate very well. Met a guy, and he kind of went around looking at universities who would give him the degree the fastest. He found a fellow in Freiburg that would do it, and so he wrote a thesis which was about 30 pages long, and never really in his later life talked much about the thesis because it wasn't really his best piece of work, but it got him the degree, and he came back kind of admiring the aura of the German university, but I think his knowledge of actually the German system was fairly limited. And then there were some people like Paul Shorey, the distinguished classicist, who went over, got to know it very well, and hated every minute of it, and comes back as a kind of a Germanophobe, and is one of those who urged the university to urge Woodrow Wilson to enter the war against Germany long before we did in April of 1917. And then even after the war continues to hate the Germans. So he was kind of unflinching and unrelenting in his... it's kind of, what did the Americans know and when did they know it? And certainly the aura of science is important. But I think the other thing that's much of the recent research has borne out is there was another facet to the German universities, not so much their teaching, although they were teaching machines. They were large-scale machines for the certification of civil servants and gymnasium professors. But they made a calculated gamble in a way, or one could say that after the fact, that they really enjoyed a very broad legitimacy within the German public, were very much supported by the public, but it was only a very partial public. It was a kind of middle-class, upper-middle-class Protestant public. The Catholics really weren't welcome. Women certainly weren't welcome. Social Democrats and working-class people weren't welcome. Jews were tolerated, but not particularly welcome. And so that in a way, the crisis of the German university system begins long before 1933, and the legitimacy that they enjoy, this very, very much potent German nationalist conception of the university as the kind of source of the nation, which is experienced a tremendous crisis after 1918, leaves them kind of moreless and lacking in they lack the past that they thought they had to legitimize themselves. They increasingly, as society becomes more and more complicated, they really find it very difficult to reach out to the German public because the public was no longer simply an upper or middle class Protestant public. And I raise this issue because I think that in the title of Jonathan's book is the word American, and we are world universities, but we are also accountable to and have to deal with our own society. And my own view is that books like this are very welcome because I think we have a lot of explaining to do, explaining of what we do and what we're not doing, if we're going to maintain the trust of the broad American public going forward. I think that that's something that one cannot take for granted, and we could talk more about that in the questions. The second is teaching. It's funny, and I'm sure Jeff has had this experience when he was provost, and probably those of you who have interviewed candidates, if you ask people when they, especially senior people who are being recruited here, why would you want to come to the University of Chicago? And you say, well, this is not a trick question. I'm just kind of curious as to, why would you want to leave University X or Y on the East Coast or the place in Palo Alto and the West Coast? They'll often say, well, I've heard this is a more interdisciplinary place, and so I want to come because the university is more interdisciplinary. And then, of course, as an historian, I will ask them, well, how do you think we became interdisciplinary? And it's not a trick question. And they're kind of befuddled by that, and usually they can't answer it, and so you switch to another question. My own view is that these are cultural practices. They're discursive ideals, cultural ideals, but they're also practices. And that I think that certainly the divisional structure, the kind of administrative structure that we have in place here has contributed by allowing very important kind of agencies above the level of the department and below the central administration to actually encourage interdisciplinary collaboration. But also I think the way in which we teach, both on the undergraduate and graduate level, and I would argue that the core, one of the functions of the core, I think it's important we teach in the core because it's our responsibility to do so, but the point I'm making is a somewhat different one, and that is to say the practice of collaborating with people and fighting with people, these great core wars, which Jeff and I lived through in the 90s, endless discussions of people being lobbied as, should we have a biology requirement, and the number of classicists and people from the deepest environs of the history department having to take a position on that. It actually does, over time, acculturate people to getting outside their own little feudal entity. And I think so teaching as a cultural practice here has been very important in the creation of our identity, and I hope it will continue to do so in the future. The final point I wanted to make is about Hutchins. Jonathan's book is very complimentary to Hutchins, singling out I think really almost heroic defense of academic freedom at a time when it was not easy to do that. It's never easy to do that, and those of you in the room who've had to do that in this time know it's never easy. But it was particularly difficult in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s. And I think I'd like to say two things about that. One is Hutchins was a real champion, a kind of thoroughbred. Paul Douglas in his autobiography, which is there's a passage about Hutchins and the Broyles affair. It's interesting though that Douglas was much more of a radical when he was on the faculty than he wanted to be known when he was in the Senate. And although he describes Hutchins as a champion, he was also sending letters urging that we not reveal anything about what he was doing in the 1930s because it might get him into trouble in the 1950s. So that he had a sense of survival. But I think it's important to note that behind Hutchins were some very, very distinguished chairman of the Board of Trustees, Harold Swift and Laird Bell in particular. And I think it's very difficult for anybody, a president or a dean or a provost, to stand up and do what Hutchins did. And he did it quite magnificently without the support of the board, and especially without the leadership of the board. And we've been very fortunate here to have trustees, especially the leadership of the trustees, not all of them. Some of them did not understand what academic freedom was all about, and were very unhappy with Hutchins, and actually would have been happy if he had been left and gone to Washington. But the leadership did, and I think that was very important in maintaining his credibility and his effectiveness as a spokesman for these ideals. The other thing I want to mention, though, and that is that at the same time that Hutchins was defending academic freedom to the outside, there was enormous unhappiness among the senior faculty at this institution about the way he was, in a sense, defending their academic freedom as custodians of the curriculum to the inside. And if you read the memoranda and letters surrounding the famous petition of Frank Knight and Crane and Jacob Viner and others to the Board of Trustees in the 44, really alleging that Hutchins was out to destroy the autonomy and academic freedom of the faculty, the departments, et cetera, abolishing tenure and so forth. What comes through is not that they were afraid of Hutchins, because of someone like Frank Knight, who was kind of got up every morning to be belligerent and loved to be belligerent, and he didn't go to sleep until he was sufficiently belligerent. These guys weren't afraid of Hutchins, but what they did feel was that he was insulting them because the kind of iconic documents that we associate with Hutchins now, the higher learning, no friendly voice, they took to be basically saying that his fellow faculty members were insensitive, were really didn't care about higher education, were kind of very narrow, were kind of really not very smart and very not creative, and they thought that was not the case. And so there were very, very serious tensions throughout the Hutchins presidency, particularly though, it's fascinating that they kind of come up during these periods at the time Hutchins is called upon to defend us to the outside world. And I think one could say more about his presidency. There were very great high points. There were very serious mistakes, and mistakes that cost the university dearly. But I do think that since a lot of Jonathan's book, or at least a good part of it, has to do with styles of leadership and the kind of leadership that universities need to defend themselves and protect their values and to move them forward. That there is this fine line between being fearless to the outside and being reckless to the inside. And there were a lot of people at this university, people who oftentimes sat in this room, who felt that Hutchins didn't quite get that balance, and that it's true, he was very fearless to the outside, but there oftentimes he was reckless toward the faculty, and they were very unhappy with that.
I think my comments are going to largely be a footnote to Steve Berry's remarks. I should note that for those of you who are interested in the Great American University volume of John's and haven't yet seen it, the mobile seminary cooperative bookstore is going to be right outside that door when we finish, and Jack Seller is going to be there for a book signing if you have any interest. I suppose I've now been at the University of Chicago for 37 years, and I suppose my own philosophy of education can be boiled down to a single maxim, which is, if someone asserts it, deny it. If someone denies it, assert it. And I've actually given a seminar occasionally with that title, which has a subtitle, Political Correctness and Critical Reason in the Social Sciences. And I think that of all universities I know, this is the university that has institutionalized that somewhat Socratic-sounding principle to the greatest degree. And John alluded to the Calvin Committee report, which I view as one of those grand documents. My remarks actually are going to go back and forth between a discourse that I associate with the dawn of the great university and another discourse that I associate with its twilight, and I'm going to mention both of them. But let's start with the Calvin Committee report. Some of you may know it by heart, even keep it next to your bed as I do. But this is a document prepared by a faculty committee consisting of my former colleague Jack Getzells, but also John Hope Franklin, the historian, George Stigler, the economist. It was chaired by Harry Calvin Jr., who was himself a Socratic eminence. I won't let our moderator be too invisible in a number of ways. One of them is he, for many years, in fact, was the Harry Calvin Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, and Calvin wrote a great book called A Worthy Tradition on free speech, which I recommend to all of you. But here's what it says in the Calvin Committee report. Institutional neutrality, first of all, and faculty and student autonomy are the key principles expressed in the report. And the university as an institution is cautioned against taking any collective action on hot-button social and political issues of the day. Rather, the mission of the university is described as follows, here quoting, "The mission of the university is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. Its domain of inquiry and scrutiny includes all aspects and all values of society. A university faithful to its mission will provide enduring challenges to social values, policies, practices, and institutions. By design and by effect, it is the institution which creates discontent with the existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. In brief, a good university, like Socrates, will be upsetting." And then the report goes on to say, the instrument of dissent and criticism is the individual faculty member and individual student. The university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic. It is, to go once again to the classic phrase, a community of scholars. To perform its mission in the society, a university must sustain an extraordinary environment of freedom of inquiry and maintain an independence from political fashions, passions, and pressures. A university, if it is to be true to its faith as in intellectual inquiry, must embrace, be hospitable to, and encourage the widest diversity of points of view within its own community. It's a community only for the limited, albeit great purpose of teaching and research. It's not a club. It's not a trade association. It's not a lobby. So that's the discourse of the dawn of the great university. This, too, from our articles of incorporation, is, I think, in that same spirit. It says, the basic policies of the University of Chicago include complete freedom of research and the unrestricted dissemination of information. Now let's get to the enemy is us themes. Here's another document from the University of Chicago, which I associate with the twilight. We regret to inform you that IRB approval of your research protocol has expired. Please note that research-related activities, including interaction with human subjects, data collection, and/or data analysis, may not continue or be initiated until the IRB has approved the continuation of this research. There you have an institutionalization at the University of Chicago of a mechanism for giving permission or denying permission to do research and to engage in free inquiry. That is a policy applied across the board to all research at the university, regardless of funding source, despite the fact that there is no federal requirement to do that. There is a federal requirement to set up an IRB process for federal funds. Nevertheless, internally, a decision gets made. Over time, it evolves that now institutionalizes this licensing procedure for research at an institution that is fully committed to the discourse of the dawn, yet has moved itself into an institutional position which sounds very much left to me like the twilight discourse. John Cole, in his book, has a footnote. It's only a footnote, but I think a rather important one, in which he says, I'm omitting discussion here of a host of other possible constraints on academic freedom in research. I've not discussed the way other government regulations, such as those involving institutional review boards, may needlessly limit free inquiry. Nor have I discussed the rise of a cadre of lawyers that are part of today's academic landscape and the role they play in limiting some dimensions of academic freedom. So I just want to put on the table the role of lawyers, risk management, all sorts of advisors who tell the university what they should do and not do from a liability point of view, which now compete with some of this wonderful discourse of the dawn that we feel proud of when we think of the University of Chicago and its deep traditions. There are just two other issues I want to quickly raise. I mentioned the Calvin report, and I mentioned that I don't want to let our moderator remain invisible. So I want to quote Geoff Stone, who wrote a blog statement at on a law school blog trying to address and consider the issues surrounding the university's decision, invoking the Calvin report, not to divest from Darfur. And Jeff wrote the following, which is, in my view, an eloquent statement in the discourse of the dawn. He said, what the Calvin report forbids are decisions of the university designed expressly or symbolically to proclaim right moral, political, or social positions. Lawyers know about slippery slopes. If the university divests from Darfur, then others will surely insist that the university must divest from corporations that manufacture cigarettes, perform abortions, sell arms to Israel, and pollute the environment. Of course, there are degrees of right and wrong and degrees of evil, but it's not the role of the university to take positions on such questions. Indeed, The university should no more divest on the basis of these sorts of issues than it should prohibit students and faculty from speaking freely on campus in support of tobacco subsidies, the moral legitimacy of murdering abortionists, the right of Palestinians to destroy Israel, or even the morality of genocide, or we don't have enough pollutants yet. And Jeff goes on to conclude his reflection by saying the following: the role of the university is not to decide such questions, but to create and nurture an environment in which we may freely and openly debate them without fearing that the university has already resolved them on our behalf. Well, I think he might just well have said, of course, that in fact, he did say, in effect, in brief, a good university like Socrates will be upsetting. Yet, I wonder, and I like to put it on the table for us all to wonder, whether even at the great universities of the United States, members of the faculty of these great universities would in fact actively or even passively support an institutional environment that protected such debates and conversations of the type that were just noted. I think that there's a kind of internal self-censoring. I think there's an enormous amount of fear of getting involved in topics of that type, or even coming forward to freely discuss them. And we need to consider how that's happened and how to maintain an environment that actually allows the kinds of discussions Jeff was imagining to go forward in the spirit that we associate with the University of Chicago. Finally, I want to just raise an issue that has to do with commercialization. There's another statement in our statutes. Interestingly, this is a preamble to our patent policy, statute number 18, in which it straight out says, research done primarily in anticipation of profit is incompatible with the aims of the university. Okay. Now, John talks a lot about the benefits that follow from basic research for the broader American public. And the question that arises in my mind is whether or not, I guess the question is, does the greatness of the great universities derive from the fact that they aim to serve the material interests of the United States population, or does it derive from the fact that they don't? Okay. And we do have a university motto, which in rough translation might be translated as "let knowledge grow so life may be enriched," which is sort of ambiguous with regard to whether or not the aim is that enrichment or the aim is knowledge. When in discussing the Bayh-Dole amendment, John says the following, and I just want to put this on the table and I suppose raise it as a question for him. He says, given these kinds of returns, he's talking about the financial returns of the patents and inventions, it should come as no surprise that over the past decade, interest in technology transfer and entrepreneurship has grown at many of the great research universities. The entrepreneurial impulse is very much a part of American history, and faculty members, despite professorial stereotypes to the contrary, have responded to the incentives contained in the Bayh-Dole Act. In fact, many professors, and not only scientists and engineers, have demonstrated enormous interest in creating ideas that have commercial value, both because of the implications for business and for their educational value. It's also fair to say that the norm of disinterestedness, of not gaining personally from your own discoveries, has eroded in university culture over the past few decades. And here we have a kind of detached, somewhat positive science description of the scene, but I want to shift it to a normative discussion and wonder about the relationship of commercial values to academic values, and whether or not we in fact are on a kind of slippery slope in which one is going to ultimately dominate the other. I'll conclude by saying that some years ago I was at a Christmas party in Boston, Cambridge, where I met a headhunter for university presidents, quite distinguished headhunter who is involved in many prominent searches for university presidents. And he looked me in the eye and straight out said the following: well, you know, university presidents are basically good for 7 years. That's one fundraising cycle, and after that they're really beyond good use. And then he went on to say, and of course there are only two things that matter in fundraising: nanotechnology at the time, and microbiology as it relates to medicine, because people want to be immortal. And that's it. The rest doesn't matter. And that opened my eyes to a certain reality, but of course it made me wonder about all the rest. There was a comment made many years ago at this university by a member of our mathematics department at a council meeting, in which he raised the question about the hospital tail wagging the university dog. And I'm sure there are many members of this university who are now wondering about what dominates in considerations about programs to go into, and whether or not patrons, sources of funding, and commercial benefits may be entering into academic decision-making. So those are the issues I want to put on the table. I'll stop there.
Very, very brief, because I'd love to open it up for questions, and I perhaps can respond to a few things that people have said in the context of responding perhaps to others' questions. I'm really interested in what the audience has to say. But let me take up Rick's observation on the Bayh-Dole. And I do think that one can overlook one thing that lies behind the intention of Bayh-Dole, and that is to say, to try to incentivize the transfer of knowledge into, if you will, the marketplace. But it's not simply a matter of the marketplace. It is a matter of trying to get certain kinds of discoveries that will help the population enormously, that will prevent blindness, that will prevent certain kinds of diseases through hopefully the discovery of drugs and other kinds of things that would not otherwise get to these populations and would not otherwise help the society. Now, we tend to get lost at the universities in the revenue stream that is brought in by a successful home run of one of these patents and licensing, and the implications of that for our value system. And I think that's a completely legitimate focus of our attention. But I don't think we should lose what some of the original intention was of Bayh-Dole, which is to try to bring these discoveries to rapid use, not purely for profit, but also to benefit the larger public in a variety of ways. I mean, I'm happy to go on at some length later, if you wish, on disinterestedness and how the norm has changed, but let me leave it at that. I do think, by the way, that all the comments that I've heard are not only interesting, but they're nuanced. When I think of the Calvin Committee report, I sometimes think of Supreme Court justices who walk around with a copy of the Constitution in their pocket. Here's my copy of the Calvin Committee report, which I normally have in my breast pocket or something like that, which is sort of the mantra of what I think the value systems really ought to look like in a great research university. So. There's much to be said in what is contained in that document and the efforts to realize the full potential of that. I want to say that, unfortunately, even in the director's cut of this 600-page book, which turns out to have been initially 1,000 pages, I didn't have some of the things that John Boyer was referring to. And I think that his set of essays, which he kindly sent to me, that he periodically does, I don't know if you do it on an annual basis, but they're really quite wonderful essays on the history of the University of Chicago, and are nuanced in the sense that they really do show some of the double-sidedness of people like Hutchins. And I'm certainly focusing on one aspect of that, more one side than the other, partly because I didn't know as much about the other side, but I did know some of that. I certainly knew what the reactions were to his bringing in Adler and trying to change the curriculum. I certainly knew that there was hostility on the faculty to some of the efforts that he made internally. But I was thinking of it mostly in terms of the larger picture that I was trying to paint in the book. Now, I think also, and then I'll stop. Stephen Barry's comment on evaluating universities by the products, the creativity of alumni is wonderful, and I think what it, on the one hand, it points to is that we have very incomplete measures of the greatness of universities, and most of them, because they're easiest to measure, actually focus on research and research output. I mean, it's much more difficult to measure teaching at these universities, the quality of teaching, for example. But it is also extremely difficult, and very few universities that I know of do it, ever try to measure the value added. So let me take your creativity measure. Suppose I look at the alums who are extremely creative. How do I know that they got anything out of the University of Chicago? They may have come in creative, and they left creative. So, measuring those kinds of things are important, but they're not easy to do, and perhaps we haven't met the challenge of doing that, because I think it would be very useful to find out not only what the curriculum is doing and what the actual experiences are doing to our students, whether they, by the way, be undergraduates or postdoctoral students. I think we underestimate completely the amount of teaching that goes on at the doctoral and postdoctoral level, which is scores and scores of hours, intimate relationships that are carried on all the time in learning and teaching. We tend to focus, again, on the classroom teaching of undergraduates. And that is not measured terribly well either. Well, let me stop, Jeff, because I'd really like to hear from the audience.
Steve had one comment.
I just wanted to make a comment regarding Rick's concern about the possible insidious effects of profitable research. I do know of one particularly awful example at another university where several research groups were doing collaborative work with industry. The graduate students in the different research groups were not allowed to talk to each other about their research because of proprietary concerns. And I think that was an extremely insidious phenomenon. Absolutely a scary example of the kind of thing you're worried about. So it can happen.
I just 30 seconds. The concept of indirect consequentialism, I think, is behind some of the analysis in this book. So the idea is the benefits are the indirect consequences of a certain kind of academic tradition and basic research tradition. And the worry I would have is that it's no longer indirect consequentialism, that the consequences start getting represented and made available in a way that makes them direct. And when that happens, then this process goes on, which erodes the traditions that were behind the basic research in the first place.
Why don't we open it up to questions?
Yes.
So I'm a senior in college, and I guess my question is takes on a bunch of discussions that I've had with different faculty members and my experience in teaching. Some of the best teachers I've had have been ones who came from the college, who may have gotten their PhDs here, but who sort of spent their lives and even their educational lives here at the university. And I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a law professor, and I was saying how sad is it they're all close to retirement or soon to retire, and we're sort of losing that nepotism. And he was saying, no, what it means is that we're becoming more professional. So I wonder, I guess it's a question for Dean Boyer, but I wonder how do we balance in terms of looking at faculty as the academic world itself changes? How do we balance both our desire to be a very special university in terms of our core and the college's traditions of being interdisciplinary, and the fact that academia in general has gotten more specialized, since it's even caught in more and more sort of caught in disciplinary web. So I wonder, how do we respond to that challenge?
I think what you're referring to, there was a time in our history, and actually this actually is relevant to Hutchins too, so maybe I can bring back Hutchins. He's kind of everywhere in our DNA. There was a time in our history when one of Hutchins' less fortunate decisions was to recenter the BA to begin to admit kids who had only 2 years of high school, and then they put them through what was called an all general education curriculum. and then graduated them around 19. It turned out American society was not ready for this. They were trying to steal the best, and I use the word quite deliberately, steal the very best high school students from the high schools before the high schools were ready to give them up. It was an absolute disaster. Our enrollments plummeted, and the university took decades, beginning with, I would say, between the valiant efforts of President Gray, who's here today, to begin to rebuild the college's enrollments. There was a time then to manage that curriculum. The college got faculty who were only appointed in the college, and some of them were alums of the university, many of them were not, and there was a tradition at that point that one really valorized the idea of teaching but not having extensive research credentials. The problem with that as a system was that it made because of the larger nexus in which the college operated, it made the people doing this teaching seem to be and feel to be second or even third-class citizens. It made them feel bad. They were marginalized vis-a-vis the rest of the faculty, and subsequent generations, beginning with Larry Kimpton and especially with Ed Levy, thought that for all of the value of having a faculty only devoted to undergraduate teaching, the downside of it was that if you want to have a faculty who is continually renewed, kind of on the cusp of new research, that you need people who are doing their own research and who are really respected by faculty more generally. And so there was a movement beginning in the 1960s and accelerating in the 70s and 80s to go through our current system of joint appointments where faculty are appointed both in the college and to a graduate division. I think that in the long run this has served the college well. I think that and I understand fully, and I'm certainly sympathetic with the idea that we should have people who only do college teaching, but I think for the larger interests of the university, and I would say for the college in the long run, we have been well served by having active scholars as doing the primary teaching in the college, and I think that that's and I think that's kind of if that's normal in terms of what the rest of the universities have done. I think that's a normality which was good to come back to. I think there are a lot of other things we can be proud of, and how we sustain the interdisciplinarity of the core is a different question. It seems to me that is very different from who's doing the teaching, and that's a very interesting issue. I know Columbia has the same kind of issues because this kind of teaching is not necessarily always seen to be the most professionally rewarding, at least in the first instance, although I think in the long run it's very rewarding. And how these universities sustain general education curriculum is a different question than who's doing the teaching.
I just wanted to thank you for your book. I'm about halfway through it and I'm enjoying it a lot. And I appreciate especially your willingness to uphold the ideal of the research university at a time when it's hard to do. But your examples of what counts as research, not entirely in the book, I grant you, but the ones you've foregrounded here today are mainly scientific, and they're mainly, even to a degree, feats of engineering rather than discovery in the first place, although the feats of engineering are grounded in discovery. But they certainly foreground a notion of discovery that's primarily belongs to the natural sciences, it seems to me. So my question is about how you see the role of research in the other end of the disciplinary spectrum in the humanities and social sciences. And to put a little edge on the question, I want to say that the most recent book about higher education I read before yours was one by Anthony Kronman at Yale. I don't know if you read that one, called something like The End of Education, which is essentially arguing that the humanities made a terrible mistake in signing on to the agenda of the research university, that they were never that kind of enterprise at all, and that in attempting to do this, they seriously disadvantaged themselves with respect to other fields, complicated that with some bad decisions involving political correctness and constructionism and so on in the 1970s, and are now, for that reason, in a terrible mess. I think that's the wrong analysis and the wrong solution. But the question is, what model of research can you offer that adjusts the model of scientific discovery in a way that helps us do our advocacy?
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful question, and I do try to extend the definition of discovery in the book, in fact, to the domains of the social behavioral sciences as well as the humanities. Although I spend less time on the humanities, it's a little bit more difficult to convince the general public that these are discoveries, although I really think that if you look at the OED and the definition of discovery, opening up an entirely new set of literatures to people through translation, various other kinds of things, philosophical concepts that are new and important are very much within the framework of real discoveries. Within the book, I certainly focus on many what I would call discoveries that have changed our lives and ways of thinking that are part of the social and behavioral sciences, many of which have been done here at the University of Chicago. I mean, and they're ways of thinking, for example, from concepts, things which have entered almost the vernacular of the American educated population. Ideas about the self-fulfilling prophecy, the concept of human capital, the idea of a focus group, the idea of role models. All of these kinds of things all emerge out of these universities and represent, I think, discoveries of a kind. And beyond that, of course, a variety of things that have come out of economics that have influenced the society very broadly, from the Taylor rule to a variety of ways in which financial models are developed. So I think that the effort is to get to the next 100 pages, for one thing, where I hope I will convince you that there is attention to be that is being paid to these areas. Now, a couple of things. One is, it is easier to make the case to the educated American public on science and engineering. So if you just want to make the case of these things that they all know as discoveries, they're more willing to accept that, and that's part of the strategy, I suppose, of the book. But that's not enough, and that's not sufficient. And I do think that in the last part of the book, for example, I think that I talk about the paucity of funding for the humanities, the way in which we have not really allowed the humanities to be viewed as at the very essence of the university. I mean, when I was in China and giving some advice to the Chinese about how to create a great university from scratch within the next 25 years, one of the things that these very well-intentioned leaders, very brilliant leaders, were saying, well, by the way, our great university doesn't need the humanities. You can do away with those. And by the way, sociology, your field, we certainly don't need that, because that's only going to lead to trouble. And what we're really interested in is science, engineering, and the spin-offs that come from that. And I was arguing that more than ever, a great university has to have these fields. I mean, you can't really do certain kinds of work, I believe, in fundamental work, for example, having to do with human cloning, stem cell research, without having a group of people addressing the ethical, moral, and other kinds of issues that surround the work that is going on in those fields. And the dialogue has got to take place, the discourse has got to take place. So one would hope that it was a kind of seamless web that existed at great universities between and among these fields. It doesn't. I think it exists more at the University of Chicago, as was suggested, than at other places. But it certainly is my intention in the book not to be dismissive in any way, or not to value strongly the discoveries, as it were, that come out of the humanities and the social and behavioral sciences that, in fact, are changing our lives and are changing the lives of the people who are going to be reading the book.
Gentlemen, I think it's a mistake to try to use the word discovery to cover so large a spectrum of the intellectual activity that goes on in a research university. That is, so much of what is involved in the humanities has to do with rethinking, reinterpretation, new interpretation, and so on. All those things discoveries, as opposed to thinking about the scholarly and philosophical and other ways in which humanistic scholarship proceeds, is, I think, a mistake. And I think that in asking for research universities to be responsible simply for discovery, one loses the sense of what great scholarship can be, which does not necessarily have to do with discovering new data, which does not necessarily have to do with archival research, which does not necessarily have to do with science. The same is true, obviously, in some of the social sciences. That is a very difficult thing to explain, but I think that if one uses the terminology of discovery to try to communicate it, one actually shortchanges the humanities. I think also, if I just make that different point, you're absolutely right that when people talk about universities, the public, media, and so on, they usually really mean undergraduate education. I don't think you can talk about research universities without talking about undergraduate education. Because as you said, we have an amalgam of the graduate research and collegiate in our research universities. We have different styles of collegiate education, and the university style of it is different from a small liberal arts college. There are different opportunities, different ways of learning, and so on and so forth. One reason why the tax-paying public is reluctant to continue to support some of the great public universities is because they think undergraduate education is being charged. That at a very high cost, they're being asked to support an increasingly, or perhaps decreasingly, good product. And that, therefore, they see, in some way, not that research doesn't matter, and it's certainly important to bring to everybody's attention, as you have, the ways in which it does. But they need to understand why, in the context of a good, great university, since we're using in this self-congratulatory, triumphalist way, only the language of greatness, which I abhor somewhat. Still, they need to understand that a great university has to have great undergraduate education, as well as great research and graduate training and all the rest of it. They need to understand what it is in such a university that undergraduate education can be, and they need to understand that something is being done about that too. In other words, their belief that somehow it's in decline is, I think, a serious problem. And if I can make one more point, I apologize. I think that in talking about the future of universities and what it is that is so challenging and what it is that makes them fragile, we've talked about the values of universities, and I think it's an excellent catalog and an excellent set of commitments. But we haven't talked about the underlying dynamic that is driving all universities and that makes higher education in some ways similar to the healthcare system problem. And that is that higher and higher levels of understanding, of discovery, of knowledge drive ever more expensive next stages in the evolution not just of research, but also of teaching, writing, all the necessary infrastructure for up-to-date understanding of the different fields and so on. And that dynamic of growth confronting a much lessened growth in the larger economy. It's not that we haven't seen it before, but we're seeing it now in a still larger way. And I think that we are suffering from what might be called a series of explosions that whose results are catching up with us. We haven't come to terms with the question of the balance that we can strike in terms of the structures that we have now. We're taking for granted that these universities are great, they're going to be this way all the time. They can't be this way all the time. And yet we want to preserve the values we talk about within whatever structures we can create, imagine, to contain them. We haven't talked about that.
Well, as is always the case, Hannah, you raise not only wonderful questions, and very thought-provoking questions, but questions that I want to think about probably would be good for another seminar. Let me just respond very briefly to each of the points that you make, because I think each of them is extremely important, and it may point to shortcomings in some ways in the book. In the effort to emphasize what these universities have done have produced, as it were. And I think this is to some extent what Rick was referring to earlier. There is less emphasis in the book, and it was a strategic decision. It may have been the wrong decision to not emphasize as much the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, simply for its own sake. I mean, in a non-utilitarian way, without looking at what benefits come of it or doing cost-benefit analysis of it, but the intrinsic value of this work for the people who are doing it as well as for the people who are studying there. When one thinks about the humanities, you're absolutely right, Hannah, that there's so much of it that is there that isn't tied to the sense of discovery in terms of utilitarian products, and there has to be room at any great university for that other part of the pursuit of knowledge by students or by faculty members that is not designed in any way to have any kind of necessary practical impact, but is exploring deep philosophical issues, issues about the nature of language, a whole series of things, of values. So probably de-emphasized more than I should have in the book, or certainly worth me trying to find the passages that I could cite for you where I do take it up. On the issue of undergraduate education, again, whether or not that is, it's certainly not the focus of this book, but it is recognized, I think, in the book that the great universities, if you'll pardon the term great again, have certain advantages over the liberal arts colleges in the undergraduate opportunities that they can afford to people, youngsters working with scholars, scientists who are at the very cutting edge of their disciplines, and the ability for them to explore certain kinds of possibilities by themselves, even in laboratory work when they get a bit older, or in archival work that they can do at these great libraries and the like, that they might not have the opportunity to do at liberal arts colleges. So you've given me more to think about about undergraduates, and if I was writing the next edition or the preface to the next edition, what I might put in there and what I have possibly omitted from there. And then, of course, the dynamic question, I think. Let me say one more thing about undergraduate education, because it comes in many flavors in the United States. And if you, and I know you just were lecturing in California, if you think of the California model that originated with Clark Kerr, it was certainly not entirely realized, but it was this effort to have at once great access to these wonderful institutions, as well as a competitiveness at the highest levels of scholarly achievement. And there's something about the design of those institutions, while they don't have the small classes that we have at Columbia or Chicago or various other places, provide opportunities for undergraduates in a way that they might not otherwise have it, even in those rather large facilities where it seems impersonal, but where many of those youngsters still can be studying in fields and if they're motivated properly and get proper encouragement, can have extraordinary undergraduate careers. So I'm not sure that the criticism of the population of California is well placed. It may be. I'm not sure. Yeah. But that is the perception. I think you're right. And then you talk third about the dynamics, and I think it's extremely important that we look into the ways in which we have to not only be adaptive in our system and not be wedded only to the past. I think the core values are going to remain pretty much the same, although there have been adaptations. But the structure of the growth of knowledge, I think we have to be much more attentive to, and how that may well change. I mean, the existence of the predominance of silos and barriers and fetters to the growth of knowledge and ideas in most universities, far more than at the University of Chicago, it seems to me, is a real deep problem if we're going to try to attack certain kinds of problems. And there are going to be have to be adaptations that are made to the structures of the system. the cost factors that you were alluding to also, as I think you were alluding to with the healthcare reform and things like that, I think is another very important issue. Whether or not, for example, there is as much waste in our system as there is, I think, in the healthcare system, is a matter that I would be interested in looking into. But there isn't any question that the cost of doing this research is getting much greater, and the question of whether or not you can have a model in which all universities have to compete against each other doing the same thing or trying to do the same thing is an open question. I think it's a good question. I worry a little bit about the absence of competition, but on the other hand, it may be that too much of a good thing will create a set of negative consequences that will react back on the rest of the institution to its detriment. So maybe there ought to be more levels of specialization than there are. I mean, anyway, Hannah, as usual, you raise extraordinarily interesting questions, and I'll try to think some more about them as time goes on.
Well, we have to be out of here in about 3 minutes. We have time for one more quick question and one answer.
Yeah, so I want to raise the issue of funding a bit more. So let me explain that. So I came from Germany 2 years ago, and I couldn't agree with you more that the universities in Europe are in disarray. They have a lot of catching up to do. But, you know, freedom of academic research is a constitutional right in Germany. There's nothing that prevents German law from entrepreneurial spirit to come along and, you know, put a great research university, you know, anywhere, right, and start what has been done here at the University of Chicago. You come across the ocean, and there it is, right? There's a great research university, it functions, and it's funded, and it costs a lot of money to do that, right? So that's surprising to me that this can be maintained for so many years at so many places in the United States. And what's the secret? I think if you could tell the Europeans that secret, if you could tell China that secret.
Well, I think the traditions in Europe have been so different about public financing of education, the taking that as also as a given. I don't think that, I mean, academic freedom per se is not the fundamental problem that European universities face. That's for sure. But they face a whole series of other structural problems that are significant. There's just not, you know, for a whole host of reasons, private giving to universities has not been something that is in the traditions of the European universities. There have been some efforts to start private universities in Italy and Germany. I don't know how successful those have been. They're in their infancy, and I don't think that they've taken off, certainly, yet. One of the things that interests me, and I talk about it in the book, is why is it that some of the great new wealth in the United States, unlike Rockefeller and Carnegie and others, while they're giving huge gifts by past standards in the absolute dollar sense to universities, hundreds of millions of dollars in fact, are not giving the kinds of gifts that are truly transformative for a university. So why is it that Warren Buffett decides to take his money and put it along with the Gates people and the Gates Foundation, which may be doing very good work, but Lord only knows whether or not, as it were, the effects of his gift, if he were to divide his wealth up and give it to 3 universities, a mere $10 billion apiece, what the consequences in the long run for the society would be of the value of that investment in a major university as opposed to an independent foundation. What's the probability that you'd have greater returns from the university investment? That doesn't seem to be part of the contemporary American culture, and I don't know exactly why that's true, but it seems not to be.
Jonathan, I'd like to thank you again for being here. I'd like to thank our panel for what I think was a really terrific discussion, and thank you for your questions. There's a book signing in room 105 across the hall where you'll get Jonathan. Thank you, Jeff.